Well, good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Responsible Consumption and Production in the Food Sector, Implementing a Circular Economy. My name is Samaya, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. We also have a handout available for this presentation, and you can download that through the Handouts tab in your control panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please also note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank BSI who developed the content for this presentation. BSI believes the world should be supplied with safe, sustainable, and socially responsible food. They offer a broad range of agricultural, food safety certification, and risk management services to help all organizations in the food supply chain achieve compliance and industry best practice to grow their business. They are a leading food safety and certification provider with extensive auditing capacity and the capability to conduct integrated audits for a wide range of food safety standards across the entire food and beverage supply chain, including GFSI recognized standards. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event, and our first speaker is Ryan Lynch. Ryan Lynch, the director of BSI's sustainability practice, has worked with organizations across multiple regions and industries to design creative solutions to drive organizational improvement, improve upon social and environmental impacts, and mitigate and remedy risks. He leads BSI's strategy to align their standards, services, technology, and global resources to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. He and his team, together with their clients, develop and deliver innovative approaches related to clean energy and climate action, circular economy and waste, decent work in global supply chains, and other challenging areas. Our next speaker is Dave Meyer, Principal Consultant and BSI Consulting Regional Practice Leader for Sustainability and Management Systems. Dave is an EHS and sustainability-focused practitioner with over 40 years of experience in corporate governance and environmental health and safety compliance issues. He supports a wide variety of clients in providing EHS, management systems, and supplier responsibility audits. Dave has a long track record of success in leading organizations in leveraging regulatory compliance and organizational risks and identifying methods and practices to reduce waste in the production of consumer and industrial goods. At BSI, he has been focused on responsible supply chain management, comprehensive EHS auditing and compliance, including performing EHS assessments throughout the US, Canada, and Western Europe, integrated management systems, corporate materiality assessments, and responsibility reporting, and embedded sustainability strategy and implementation. So now, without further ado, I'd like to pass over control to our speakers. So Ryan, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and get started.
Great, thanks, Samaya, and thanks everybody for joining today. I know everybody has a busy work and life schedule, so the fact that you're taking 60 minutes to spend with us, we appreciate that. We hope that you get some value out of today's presentation. Like Samaya mentioned, I'm presenting this with my colleague Dave. He'll be jumping in just a few moments. Today we'll cover, we'll provide a little bit of background on our role related to circular economy. And Dave then will spend some time speaking about the concepts, speaking about how they intersect with the food sector, with packaging, with agriculture, speak about some of the business impacts and community impacts related to all the things that circularity draws in. After that, I'll spend some time to talk through a case study that we think is pretty interesting and is pretty large scale and comprehensive, and probably touches on your world in one form or another. And then we'll dive in the last quarter of the presentation. We'll dive into some practical approaches to embed circularity into your organization. We work with a lot of clients across sectors and across maturity levels who have already started to apply some of these principles. But in most cases, organizations are saying, I'm interested, I'm tinkering, I'm trying to share the concepts with peers, but I'm struggling to really sort of embed it in significant ways. So our work with our clients has been, in many cases, to operationalize some of the best practices that BSI has spent time developing through our consensus, through the work we do in standards development. I'll speak a little bit about our organization first. If you're not familiar with BSI, it's the British Standards Institution. We're the national standards body for the UK. 2021 is our 120th year, so happy birthday to us. Many people are familiar with us in our work as a standards body. So that essentially is a convening process where we facilitate dialogue across a range of stakeholders, usually in the early stages of emerging issues, to figure out what are best practices around them. How do we have agreed upon ways to develop guidelines and best practices around addressing really complex emerging risks and issues. The work that Dave and I do is part of our consulting organization, which essentially takes those standards and best practices and works with our clients to find creative ways to embed them into their businesses, whether that's sort of upskilling folks or developing management systems, doing gap assessments against current practices, et cetera. We've got other parts of our organization that validate, conduct assurance, and certify companies to these standards. So the reason I'm sharing this is a few years ago, we went through the exercise of trying to really understand what does sustainability mean to our organization. And because it takes in so many different aspects, social and water related and air and climate and emissions, if you ask 10 different people what sustainability means, you might get 10 different answers. So we leaned on the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a way to understand our own impacts, but also as a way to understand our own capabilities. And we came to the conclusion that really our biggest impact is through the work that we do in defining these best standards and working through our clients to help them advance their sustainability objectives. So, when we tried to determine which sustainable development goals best align to our work, right at the center of that was SDG 17 around partnerships. So as a standards body, as a convener and a facilitator of this type of dialogue, that role that BSI plays helps advance those outcomes through the consensus building of thought leadership that we facilitate. But in doing so, that gave us the capabilities, the network, the experience, the IP to address a range of other issues. So sort of those bigger boxes on the top or the bottom really are the ones where we do a significant amount of our work around good health and well-being, clean energy and climate action, decent work, industries, innovation and infrastructure, sustainable cities, and responsible consumption and production. If you haven't gone through this type of mapping, or if you haven't gone through a materiality assessment, even at a small scale for small and medium-sized organizations, it is a worthwhile exercise to not only understand what's material to the organization, what are your risks, what are your impacts, but also to do so from the lens of the business. What's our operational strategy? What's our commercial strategy? How does that intersect with sustainability? Pretty important to get buy-in and attention and an understanding from several levels of the organization, particularly leadership, who needs to also sign off on funding and organizational change efforts. And the more that, if this isn't done in the early stages of developing a sustainability program, the risk is that those efforts end up being sort of this other thing that somebody does in a cubicle on the other side of the building when we used to go to the office pre-COVID, and it's not something that's baked into the DNA and the mindset of the organization and of as many people in the organization as early and upstream in the process of anything that you do as possible. The last thing I'll describe about BSI is our Royal Charter. So BSI is a not-for-profit distributing organization, and the reason for being is defined in our Royal Charter. It's a really unique incorporated status, and I feel like I've only come to really appreciate that over my past few years here at BSI. Our Royal Charter is essentially the document that just defines what we do, and essentially any of the surpluses from the work that we do goes back to feed the mission described in the Royal Charter. The reason I'm putting this out there is I was reflecting on this a few months back, and the Charter describes our mandate as standardization, simplification, and the elimination of waste. And that could be through development of standards or certification to standards or helping organizations embed those practices in the day-to-day of what they do. But then it struck me as, it says it right there, elimination of waste in our charter. And obviously we had been doing work relative to waste and recycling and hazardous waste and circularity prior to that, but that kind of hit me over the head as this is baked into our DNA, not only relative to sustainability, but our role in helping advance adoption of circular economy principles. So really near and dear to what we do in all of the streams that we work in and all the sectors that we work in as well. So that's a little bit of background about the organization. I hope that also provides some insight into sort of how we see ourselves relative to circularity and working with our clients. I'm going to hand this off to my colleague, Dave Meyer, who's going to speak a little bit about responsible consumption and production, speak to some principles related to circular economy, and then speak to how that intersects with the food sector. Dave?
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan, for setting the table, so to speak. My daughter would say that that's a bad dad joke, but I think it's very important to really get an understanding of what BSI does in the marketplace, and particularly focused on the food sector, which is why we're here this morning. If you could push on to the next slide. And I've really kind of thought too over the course of the last year and what we're all probably calling COVID times, but there's also climate times as well. And I think between those two issues, it's really presented the perfect storm. It's really brought the issue of food supply disruptions, real brittle food production and delivery model in the world, and food insecurity and income disparities and distribution networks really clearly into focus. And even here in the United States, with the weather disruptions in Texas and the breakdown of critical infrastructure and water supply and resulting food shortages, I think it really underscores how vital it is to make sure that in the world, whether you're in a developed nation or a developing country, that you can assure that there's sustainable consumption and production patterns that are available to all to address some of these issues that we're continuing to face in a rapidly expanding world marketplace. And so Ryan described the Sustainable Development Goals, and one of the key tenets that we've ascribed to within BSI is SDG 12, which is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And there are some specific goals there that I want to just cover briefly as we go through here. And the first of all is by 2030 to achieve sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources, and also to have the per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce food losses along production and supply chains. That includes post-harvest losses as well. It's incumbent on us, even as consumers, to make sure that we don't over-purchase. And it's, of course, during COVID times, there's been a tendency to try to buy more than maybe what you need. And as a result, there's, even in my own household, some food spoilage that I regret having caused, because we know that food could have gone to other places. People that are less lucky than I am to be able to put food on my table. In addition, by 2020, to achieve environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste through their life cycle, along with international frameworks, and significantly reduce releases to air, water, and soil to minimize adverse impacts on public health and the environment. In addition, SDG 12.5 is focused on reduction of waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. And then to encourage companies in the food production sector, particularly large and transnational companies, to adopt sustainable practices. And then finally, to promote public procurement practices that are sustainable in accordance with national policies and priorities. So there's quite a lot to unpack in SDG 12, and we're going to spend a little time talking about what that means in the food production space over the course of the hour. More specifically, around SDGs 12.2, .3, and .5, those are very critical around the responsible consumption and production cycle. But I direct your attention to some of the graphics here, and I think we can all agree that, you know, we every year we hear about our Overshoot Day in the world, and that means the amount of resource depletion that we have caused, where it overshoots the ability of the planet to regenerate itself. We can clearly see that the material footprint all across the world, whether it's in metal ores, fossil fuels, biomass, and non-metallic minerals, is increasing and continuing to increase despite many of our efforts to get a grasp around resource use and depletion. And it's particularly evident, interestingly enough, in Central and Southern Asia and Europe and North America, which actually exceed the world average. So there's a lot of work that we can and must be doing at a very quick pace in order to help stem the types of losses that we're experiencing and depletion of natural resources. If you can go to the next slide, please. In the food system world, there's lots of different food system impacts and many, many challenges, which we'll touch on a little bit today. One is the idea of food waste, which I've referred to as well. But I think more interestingly is the connection point between food waste and food production and greenhouse gas emissions. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the slides ahead. There's issues of over and undernutrition. I've referred to food insecurity and food deserts, particularly in impoverished areas in the developed nations as well as undeveloped nations. And also talking about the economic landscape for small farm holders. There's been lots of changes in play where large corporate agriculture has acquired smaller farms, but there's also an effort for the slow food movement to bring back organic farming and collaborative and cooperative farming in local communities. Even here where I live in Northwest United States in the Portland area, there are CSAs, which are small farms that people can cooperatively join to be able to get fresh produce directly from rather than through your grocery store. And then worker-related impacts, working conditions, impact to life, and impact to life underwater as well. We're also talking about aquaculture, not just land-based food production. And then animal conditions, which has been particularly evident in large corporate settings, particularly in the poultry industry over many years. And then the food insecurity issues, as I mentioned, these are all key challenges and impacts that we face in the world today. If you go to the next slide. So let's just dive into some basic definitions about what circular economy truly is. The idea behind a circular economy is that you have an economic system that's really aimed at eliminating waste and continual use of resource. By shifting to a system where you're designing out waste and pollution at the beginning by establishing a system that it uses regenerative, natural systems, and then keep products and materials in use for longer. So in a production environment, we're seeing lots of manufacturers reusing, sharing, repairing, refurbishing, demanufacturing, or remanufacturing, recycling, and creating a closed loop system which minimizes the use of resources and inputs and creates opportunities to reduce waste, pollution, and at the same time carbon emissions. So think within a food production cycle, there are ways that organizations can use equipment longer, use infrastructure longer, and improve the productivity of the resources. And it really contrasts with the traditional linear take and make dispose model of production in the marketplace. So that's basically what a circular economy is aimed at achieving. Next slide, please. In the food production area, circularity really can look at a number of things, but the thing that strikes me the most is that by implementing a circular economy for food, it can really reduce the sector's greenhouse gas emissions by up to 50% by 2050, and that's really a huge number. By finding ways that you can break down organic matter in the soil and return carbon directly to the soil and use regenerative methods that promote year-round photosynthesis, you can, and by planting crops that can grow longer, you can really sequester the carbon that otherwise may be lost by using more intensive methods for growing crops. Next slide, please. And then by employing the idea of regenerative agriculture, again, there are ways that as a soil scientist, I've learned the importance of being able to sequester materials and use agroforestry and no-till types of techniques in farming to minimize tillage, do rotational grazing, and switch to organic rather than synthetic fertilizers, crop rotations. These are not new methods, but these are methods that sometimes get lost in the process, but that people within the agricultural industry are quickly rediscovering and readopting, particularly small farmers, to be able to create a better health and tilth of the land to be able to continue to produce food in a way that can reach the tables. Next slide, please. In the food production space, this is something that's very interesting, is that by moving food production closer to population centers, you can really, one, reduce the carbon emissions associated with moving that food to where it's needed. But at the same time, you're more connected with the ultimate consumers of the food that you're purchasing. And this also applies in aquaculture, hydroponic vegetable production. We're seeing a lot of vertical farming, which uses actually less land and produces great food. And at the same time, you're impacting the land in less way by using organic matter to store that carbon, as I mentioned before, and you can turn anaerobic digestion to organic matter and then into compost by managing in this manner. But moving food production closer to population centers is a key approach that I think a lot of food producers are looking at employing. The next slide, please. And as I mentioned, cities generate more than 2.8 billion tons of organic waste. So by employing regenerative agricultural techniques, you can increase the amount of material that is looped back into the system for use. As I said, by using organic matter to store that carbon, using anaerobic digestion collaboratively with local wastewater and even reapplying some of that organic matter to land for beneficial use application, which we do quite a lot of here. On the west coast of the United States, you can turn that organic matter into viable compost. So that's just one example of how regenerative agriculture can improve the way that you manage, create, and utilize food. So we're going to move to a quick poll now, and I'll turn it back to Sumaya to run that poll.
Thank you, Dave. So audience members, you should be seeing that poll question on your screens. And that question is, how will or was your circular economy program resourced? So your options are, it is supported by an existing cross-functional team, or that could be new roles were created to support the program, or we primarily depend on external resources, example, consultants, or we haven't reached that point yet. So go ahead and click on the option that suits you best. And once again, that question is, how will or was your circular economy program resourced? I can see that some of you are still voting, so I'll go ahead and go over the options again. So that's, it is supported by an existing cross-functional team, or that could be new roles were created to support the program, or we primarily depend on external resources, example, consultants, or we haven't reached that point yet. Fantastic. So it seems like the majority of you have voted, so I'll go ahead and close the poll. And the results are as follows. So it seems like the majority of you voted for we haven't reached that point yet at 40%, followed by it is supported by an existing cross-functional team at 36%, and then new roles were created to support the program at 20%, and lastly, we primarily depend on external resources at 4%. Thank you everyone for participating. Back to our speakers.
Great, thanks, Samaya. And Dave, I don't know if you have any reflections on the poll results. I think it's sort of indicative of what I typically see with a lot of organizations, still relatively early stage. You know, kudos to the folks who are a bit further along. But if you're just getting started or trying to figure out exactly how do we resource it, how does it fit into our operational strategy or commercial strategy, don't be freaked out because you're in a pretty large group with other organizations. So I'm going to dive into a case study. I hope this is useful. This is a piece of work that we did this past year. It was sponsored by the UK government and done in conjunction with the IBLF, which is the Industrial Biotechnology Leadership Forum. Now, initially the ask was to do two things: to leverage the industrial bioeconomy. So what is that? Think biofuels, bioplastics, bio-based chemicals, enzyme-based products to be applied in agriculture, etc. So leverage this nascent set of capabilities in the UK to help the UK meet their net zero targets. The focus was on supporting the UK's net zero targets by leveraging industrial biotechnology capabilities. Now in the UK, they've got this great university network, got a lot of great IP that's spun up, but the challenge sometimes is in taking some of that innovative new technology to scale and operationalizing it and building it out to the market. So in the early stages of this, like I said, relatively young set of capabilities, you know, as part of the national strategy, the ask is, how do we make a conscious effort to not only use this from an environmental perspective to reduce emissions, but also leverage this to support economic goals, you know, economic growth, job creation in new industries, upskilling of citizens, etc. So we looked at a few areas here. First is, broadly speaking, you know, our work was to develop a strategy and a roadmap that focused on, first, enabling circularity and the capture of bio-based resources. That's really what I'm going to unpack over the next few slides here. You know, developing the strategy to improve waste capture systems related to organic waste, eliminating or mitigating emissions, looking for creation of new sources of raw materials, and accelerate market adoption of these bio-based products. And the thinking is, if these products that have lower greenhouse gas footprints are able to displace legacy fossil-derived fuels and plastics, there are some gains to be had there, in addition to a few more that I'll describe in a few moments. Part of the broader strategy was also focused on the commercial environment, and that speaks to my last comment about creating a commercial environment in which these newer technologies, newer, smaller businesses are able to compete on an even footing with larger legacy businesses that already have entrenched interests. And this looked at the policy landscape, taxes, incentives, behaviors that might inhibit the adoption of some of these bio-based products, fuels, plastics, etc. Big piece of this was also focused on the standards. BSI is the national standards body. So the question was, what standards are outdated that need to be updated? What standards are haven't been created yet that need to be created? You know, a big role that standards in general play inside and outside of this project are to reduce friction and to enable trade to scale and to create trust. So that was, you know, also front and center in our minds as we were going through this project to figure out, you know, are downstream users of these materials and products less confident to be able to use them because scientific standards, whether it's a safety standard or environmental standard or otherwise, hasn't really addressed something that hadn't been created when the standard had been created. So that was a big part of this project as well. And the last part is around communication. So taking a look at who are all of the stakeholders that are impacted throughout the entire network, whether that's consumers, businesses, regulators, investors, and what are their perceptions, what are their needs, what is preventing them from adopting circular practices, what's preventing them from adopting or investing in some of these bio-based technologies. So part of this looked at really 5 subsectors: biofuels, which also consisted of aviation fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, agritech, so that alludes to what I described earlier. Can we displace the use of fossil-derived nitrogen fertilizers that damage the soil, cause a great deal of runoff, that damage local waterways? Can we replace them with innovative, very sort of targeted enzyme-based technologies, seed coatings, things like that? And then also focused on bio-based plastics, and then fine and specialty chemicals. So in looking at each of these subsectors, we then prioritize them. If we look out 3 to 5 years, where do we get the biggest bang for our buck related to you know, the impact of these? And at the top of that list, based on our assessment, biofuels was where we felt we could have the biggest bang for our buck in the immediate term by increasing the mix of biofuels with current fossil-derived fuels, with investing in technologies to displace some of those legacy fuels with biofuels, and investing in the infrastructure to produce that at scale. And then followed by agritech, which again is a bit more targeted but can have an outsized impact, bio-based plastics, fine and specialty chemicals, and then bio-based textiles. Now, originally, like I mentioned, the mandate of the project was focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and, you know, with a focus on the economic impact of helping lift a new set of businesses and technologies and IP. But as we really got into it, we realized a big piece of this was focused on circularity. And I'm hoping that this case study helps unpack if we're looking at a business or a sector or a community from a really sort of end-to-end systems focused perspective, and not looking at a single discrete piece of that system at a single point in time, helps us understand obviously root causes, but also sort of second order effects and other things that might inhibit advancement of sustainable outcomes. So if we look at this entire cycle, starting at waste that's produced, specifically organic or biological waste that's produced from households, businesses, industry, agriculture, how much of that is being captured and repurposed in a circular manner? Some of it is, but a lot of it isn't. So if we're able to capture more of that, right off the bat, we are averting greenhouse gas emissions through spoilage of food and other organic waste, and that requires increased infrastructure, changes to behavior, changes to municipal infrastructure relative to capturing more of that bio-based waste from industry, from agriculture, from households, capturing that through anaerobic digestion and through composting, through industrial composting. So if we're able to do that effectively, we are not only averting emissions upstream in that process, but we're able to sequester carbon through the production of compost that's fed back to agriculture. We're able to create biogas to be used as a fuel, averting those emissions. We're able to valorize waste to feed back into the biorefining process, which then gives us more feedstock to create the cool biofuels and bioplastics and bio-based chemicals, which then feed back to the beginning of that cycle, back to households, businesses, agriculture. So creating this virtuous cycle where as the sector grows from an economic perspective and is able to produce more, there's greater confidence and awareness in households, businesses, greater use cases and applications of the products and the materials. And if that's supported by a greater ability to capture that waste, and not only capture the waste and repurpose it, but also, in essence, look at it as a mindset shift. So not looking at it as waste, but as a resource, as an opportunity to capture a resource. So there's a lot of moving parts there. And obviously, if you're a single business, this might be 30,000-foot or bird's eye view for you. But I'm sure that you could see elements of where you fit in one or more pieces here. I think this also illustrates the fact that in order to do this really successfully, not only do we need to look at this from a bigger picture, kind of systems-focused approach, but it also requires partnership and collaboration, whether it's at an industry, sort of a sector level or industry association level, or partnering with government agencies or local communities or peer companies, engaging your own employees. But I think it also touches on lobbying efforts. So if your government lobbying efforts contradict your sustainability efforts, I think that calls for a real gut check within organizations. So, really big picture, assessment, and it really required that we looked at what are tax incentives in place, what are regulations, what infrastructure's in place, communication down to things like, are households aware of how to capture this organic waste? What bin does it go into? What doesn't go into the bin? Really like even basic like labeling on a bin. So how do we standardize that and make that clear in a way that that even at the household level, we're able to capture this effectively and efficiently. Even something as simple as upscaling the production of biofilms, which are used to make trash liners, which can eliminate a friction point in the capture of organic waste. So if you think about how ridiculous it is that I get a fossil-derived plastic food container as takeout, I bring it home, I eat my food, and then I spend 5 minutes washing it, chuck it in a bin, only to hope that it actually doesn't end up in a landfill, but knowing that 80+% of it is likely to end up in a landfill is kind of crazy, just the notion of washing your garbage. So one of the concepts that really resonated with me was the ability to take your food container with quote unquote, it's contaminated with food, chuck the whole thing into a bio-based trash liner, chuck the whole thing into the right bin, and then you're capturing that as a feedstock or as energy or sequestering carbon and feeding the soil. So just at its basis, it just makes a lot of sense. So in looking at that entire complex system, we're looking at what are the waste types, what are potential feedstocks, what's the end of life hierarchy. So at the bottom of the hierarchy that we see at the bottom of the screen, things go in a landfill. We want to avoid that. At the top of the hierarchy, how do we improve efficiency? How do we avoid use? And really the big focus there was looking at sort of the typical hierarchies that are in place now and emphasizing a layer there for biorecycling. which is around valorizing those secondary organic waste into biogenic feedstock, or capturing it through anaerobic digestion, or capturing it through industrial composting. So if there's a greater emphasis on that and a greater level of investment in the infrastructure and a greater level of awareness, there's a lot of benefits to be had, which then translate not only into environmental benefits, but also into economic benefits. It's even got into creation of marketplaces to match sellers of waste with buyers of resources. So again, that gets into the notion of there is value in waste if we're not considering it waste, but being creative and finding ways to derive value from it and creating the marketplaces to eliminate the friction between the sellers of quote unquote waste and the buyers of the resource. It's something that helps the market scale and helps adoption of these practices. I mentioned sort of standardization of communication at multiple points of the value chain. And when there's that level of standardization, that level of awareness, and practices are able to scale, that increases confidence from the investment community, which then invest more into these businesses, which then creates this virtuous cycle as there's economic success that drives this. And the last point on this is, we map this to the SDGs. I started by talking about how we mapped our own capabilities, BSI's capabilities, to the Sustainable Development Goals. In this case, as a way to illustrate the impact of making these changes, we pulled out, this is only an excerpt, but I think it ended up to be about a dozen of the Sustainable Development Goals, and found tangible ways that these various sectors within the industrial bioeconomy would be able to have a positive impact. Whether that's capturing waste as a feedstock into the biorefining process, or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions through prevention of waste and breakdown of organic waste, reducing pollution, improving access to clean water by reducing the amount of petroleum-derived plastic waste in waterways, reducing water consumption in agriculture through use of some of these really innovative industrial biotechnology products, enzyme seed coatings, things like that, reducing biological sources of waste and the associated emissions, and overall improving environmental resilience, soil health, water retention by displacing overuse of some of these petroleum-derived fertilizers and chemicals that we've been putting into our natural environment. So again, that was pretty big picture, but I'm hoping that paints a picture of when done successfully, we have the opportunity to connect a lot of the dots across sectors, across stakeholders, but it does require coordination and really focused effort at an organizational level and across a value chain. The last piece that we'll cover here is around adopting and embedding circular economy principles in your business. I'll start with a number of standards that BSI has played a role in developing. It doesn't necessarily mean you always have to use a standard whenever you're embarking on anything like this, but also know that a lot of thought has been put into developing these types of standards, and any standard development process that BSI is involved in always involves a wide range of stakeholders that spend a lot of time putting input into developing this. So, really great resource. First and foremost is the Circular Economy Standard, British Standard 8001. This was developed in collaboration with organizations like DEFRA, Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Obviously, a great deal of experience and insight with organizations like that. And some of the principles that this is focused on are around systems thinking. I think that's illustrated with the case study I just shared. Innovation, stewardship, collaboration. Again, working across these value chains requires a great deal of collaboration. Value optimization, so the notion of finding value in waste and looking at waste first as a resource before we look at it as waste. And transparency, which again helps support the level of trust and engagement that's required to work across these various actors in a value chain. The next sector I'll mention is 14009, which is relatively recent. It's focused on incorporating redesign of products and components to improve material circulation. So this gets right at the heart of providing a set of guidelines around, how do I consistently embed these practices as early in the process as possible to start thinking about materials and processes and logistics and business models in the early stages of new product design, or adoption of materials. So a great set of guidelines around that. And we do have work that we're doing with clients to do just that, to look at what is my process and how do I actually have a consistent, systematic point as early in the process as possible that a wide range of stakeholders in my organization are actively asking the questions and measuring the sustainable outcomes and the impact of the choices they're making upstream in the process, instead of trying to retrofit things further downstream in the process. And the last standard I'll mention is 20,400, which is around sustainable procurement. We do lots of trainings around this. This is focused on governance and some of these impact areas around human rights, labor, environment, fair operating practices, etc. And obviously, this is relevant in that in order to access materials that support circularity, in order to have an impact in things like Scope 3 emissions, in order to make an impact relative to sustainable packaging, all of that really involves a great deal of not only collaboration, but oversight, governance, good practices relative to working with my suppliers. Some of the work that we do or that you might consider doing relative to adopting these types of practices within your organization, oftentimes it starts with understanding the current state. So a gap or a maturity assessment or benchmarking against peers relative to application of some of these circular economy principles into the business model, operational practices and footprint, supply chain processes, product design, they're all relevant from the lens of circular economy. So, looking at the materials that come in, through, and out of a process, and the energy that's coming in, through, and out of the process, understanding where there's missed opportunities, identifying where there's good practices that can be invested in and scaled, understanding where the principles within that circular economy standard I mentioned earlier can be applied. Normally when we're doing these types of exercises with clients, we're using this as the springboard into, not only understanding the current state, but identifying those opportunities to be able to build off of that. Now, we do a lot of work in supply chain, whether that's around environmental impacts, but also around things like human rights and security and business continuity. The difference between managing impacts and risks in my own operations versus managing them in my supply chain are typically around scale and control. So I might have a dozen sites that I've got a high degree of control over and a higher degree of risk, to be frank, in regards to direct liability, which sort of contrasts the scale of my 100 or 1,000 suppliers, the complexity, the lower level of control. I don't own those sites. I influence them, but I might be one of 10 customers they have. But that's also reflected in the direct liability as well. So it is a little bit of a different animal. So, the software and the risk intelligence and the methods that we employ with clients when we're working with them to extend their sustainability programs into their supply chain, we're typically trying to create a funnel. At the bottom of the funnel comes the suppliers that I should be engaging in greater depth. Some of that could be country risk for things like human rights or sustainability impacts, could be impacts of materials or products or processes when it comes to circularity, based on the probability or the exposure or the vulnerability there or the likelihood. That's when we're engaging suppliers, usually with a light touch through pushing out questionnaires through our software platforms to find out what practices do they have in place relative to the risk or the likelihood of an impact in which they're operating. Now, if they're demonstrating that they can't articulate the type of controls that they should have in place, or they're not able to describe what would be defined as a mature set of practices or management systems, then that gives us the shorter list of suppliers that we engage directly around audits, investigations, gap assessments, skills development, helping them through a CAPA process, helping them through a supplier improvement process. The model is applicable to really, many different types of impacts. Typically, these programs look like this. If we're working with a set of suppliers over, let's say, a 4-month period, we're starting with skills development around what does a good management system look like? critical thinking skills, asking good questions. How do I identify gaps and immaturity in a process? How do I map the material flow? And then work with them on, what would an improvement plan look like? So, not only do we use these opportunities in engaging suppliers or engaging a cohort of employees, within an organization across sites or across functions, not only is this a skills development opportunities, but we really do use this as the opportunity to launch, X number of pilots out of that cohort or X number of improvement plans out of that cohort, and then provide support over a longer period of time. So, for improvement plans, that might be incorporating redesign of packaging or materials to improve circulation, identifying opportunities to improve processes. Like I mentioned earlier, how do we embed consistent systematic practices upstream in the process to consistently embed an evaluation of sustainability-related impacts? And once that cohort identifies those potential projects, we prepare them for a pilot, and then we typically support them over several months, usually online through our software, where we're providing feedback, targeted questions, coaching as they're developing their improvement plan or developing their targeted pilot project. They're making the case for that, and then they're launching that within their organization. Typically then reporting out at the end of that to leadership to be able to justify investments to take something that was assessed at a pilot level, and then ideally invested in to be able to bring to scale. I think we have another poll question now.
Thank you, Ryan. So that does bring us to our second poll question. Audience members, you should be seeing that poll question on your screens. So that question is, if applicable to your business, which parts of the program will present the biggest challenges? So this question is different, and you can select all that apply. And your options are program foundations, plan development, pilot preparation, implementation. All will be equally challenging. So go ahead and select on the answer or answers that suit you best. And once again, that question is, if applicable to your business, which parts of the program will present the biggest challenges? Select all that apply, and your options are program foundations, plan development, pilot preparation, implementation. All will be equally challenging. Okay, I'll give you a couple more seconds for that. Fantastic. So I'll go ahead and close the poll now. And the results are as follows. So program foundations had 5%, and then plan development at 10%, pilot preparation at 5%, implementation at 29%. All will be equally challenging at 62%. So thank you, audience members, once again, and back to our speakers.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure how to comment on that, because it's sort of like everything is a problem and everything is a priority and everything is really hard. So I get why we had an outsized representation for that the last option. So Maya, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. It looks great.
Okay, awesome, great. So we've got actually one last slide and a wrap-up poll question. So I do see we're coming at the bottom of the hour. We left off on speaking about how do we actually adopt these practices, how do we embed them, how do we do that systematically, how do we take something that is really interesting and has a lot of potential conceptually, but can also seem kind of abstract when we get to the day-to-day of embedding that. So we gave a few examples. I hope they were helpful that we've seen with our clients or how we've worked with them. The last is just around measuring the impact, whether that's at supplier sites or company sites. We do this through immersive technology. We do this through drones. We've done downstream chain of custody assessments to understand, are recycled products, for example, going to the right waste streams. So as with any effective and mature management system, we need to be able to measure impact. There are a number of ways to measure impact. This is just an example of capabilities that can be brought to bear to do that. But of course, measuring waste, measuring diverted waste, measuring the volume of materials that meet certain characteristics, can and should be core to taking the pulse of your program as it relates to circular economy. And I think we wrap up with one last poll question here.
Thank you, Ryan. So audience members, you should be seeing the last poll question on your screens. And that question is, where are your highest impact opportunities to incorporate circular economy principles? Again, you can select all that apply, and your options are food production, operational practices, packaging, business model redesign, supply chain. So once again, that question is, what are your highest impact opportunities to incorporate circular economy principles? Select all that apply here, and your options are food production, operational practices, packaging, business model redesign, and or supply chain. And a quick reminder to audience members, you can still send in questions for Ryan and Dave. We are getting lots of great, interesting questions. I know we're almost out of time, but if you do have questions, keep sending them in. Fantastic. So I'll go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. And the results are as follows. Food production was at 62%, and then operational practices at 24%, packaging at 57%, business model redesign at 29%, and then supply chain at 24%. Thank you again for your participation, audience members, and back to you, Ryan.
Great, thanks. And I know we had the ability to select multiple choices there, which is why it added up to like 230% or whatever, but just wanted to call that out so people don't think that we're bad at math at this end. Yeah, I think that's it in regards to the content. And I know we tried to save some time for Q&A, and I think I blathered on a little bit longer than I intended, so apologies for that. I don't know if we do want to have a question now, or if not, for any of the questions that have been sent in, Dave and I are happy to respond directly via email if your information is included there. So just know that if you've asked a question, we promise we will respond to it one way or the other. Samaya, how do you want to handle that?
So what we can do is that maybe we can have time for one question, and then we can go ahead and wrap up the webinar. Does that sound good? Okay. All right, so the first question is, what are the most critical things to have in place for a successful CE program?
Dave, you want to start with that, or would you like me to?
Some of the things that immediately come to mind certainly is you've got to have good infrastructure available to be able to support a circular economy program. It's a very collaborative effort between also private industry, producers, and government agencies. It really takes policy, innovative technology, and foot power, basically, to be able to effectively implement circular economy throughout the entire value chain. Ryan, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
I guess the first thing that came to mind to me was leadership buy-in. I hear a lot of clients that struggle with that. They say, I need help making the business case to my leadership. Sometimes we do that through benchmarking, or there's sort of building out the case, with them and for them. It's a lot easier to get things done when the boss's boss is saying it's a priority. So, making that case, helping leadership understand there are, operational benefits in regards to reduced waste and costs and things like that, but also market benefits in regards to shareholders, customers, etc. So I would say that will accelerate your journey. If you've got buy-in, if you've already got it, great. Move on to the next phases, which are already heavy enough of a lift in and of themselves.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that answer. Audience members, if you couldn't attend to your questions, not to worry. The team at BSI may follow up with you later on as well. And if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email address on your screen. So that's food@bsigroup.com. So go ahead and quickly jot that down. And thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Ryan Lynch and Dave Meyer, for that fantastic presentation. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.